what is the idea of the birangona woman. It is not the government definition, and it's not the soldier's definition, and it's not the country's definition, and it's not the photographer's definition. It is the definition of how the women define themselves in that moment and afterwards.
Hi everyone, you're listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal, Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. I'm your host, Shwetha Srikanthan, coming to you from Colombo, and my guest today is the British-Bangladeshi writer, Saima Begum, joining us to talk about her debut novel, The First Jasmines. Set against the final weeks of the Bangladesh Liberation War, Saima Begum's novel follows two sisters, Lucky and Jamila, who are captured and imprisoned by the Pakistan military. Through their story, Saima brings to light the experiences of hundreds of thousands of women who endured unimaginable violence during the war. Women whose individual voices have largely been excluded from national memory and historical narratives. Saima, welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about your book.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful podcast.
Before we dive in, I'd like to invite our listeners to check out Himal's Patreon program on our website, where you can pay just $5 a month to support our mission to give South Asian literature the spotlight it deserves. To make conversations like this possible, we need the support of our listeners like you. In December 1971, East Pakistan became the independent nation of Bangladesh after a 9-month war with West Pakistan and their local collaborators. The new Bangladeshi government, days after the end of the war, publicly designated the women subjected to rape and sexual violence during the war as birangona, meaning war heroine, as an attempt to reduce their social ostracism. Almost 10 years ago, when you were researching the birangona for your undergraduate dissertation, you found so little to work with, just fragments in novels, few translations, and a handful of academic writing. You've said that this absence left you disillusioned and even upset, so you put your thesis aside. And then, almost like a gift from your subconscious, you saw the image of two sisters fleeing enemy soldiers, and it stayed with you for a decade, eventually becoming The First Jasmines. Tell us more about how that image carried you through those years, and at what point you realized it was no longer just a fragment, but the beginning of your novel.
What I should discuss first is my experience in academia. What I found was that I had expected a lot more from it than I was given on this topic. So I was expecting more history, more testimony, more academic research. And what I found was so greatly lacking and so greatly demoralizing. And not only was I intellectually disillusioned, I was also morally disillusioned, because I was wondering about those historians and those academics and those researchers. And I was wondering, what was it that made these women's stories only valuable enough to fit into a footnote or a throwaway line at the end of a history book, or just squeezed into a very short paragraph in a fiction novel? And while I was struggling, I realized that academia didn't quite encompass holistically what I was yearning for from the stories of these women. So I found myself kind of being pulled into the direction of fiction. I realized I didn't want to read another academic paper, and no academic paper would satisfy my need to know more about these women. I was being told that there were hundreds of thousands of women who had been raped. That is a huge number. But then I couldn't find them anywhere, whether it was in history books or, testimonies. There weren't very many testimonies. And so what began as difficulty in completing an undergraduate dissertation slowly morphed into this intense desire to want to write about these women holistically. And I found that this image that came to me, and really who knows where this image came from, it might be a gathering of all the testimonies I had read. It might have been my imagination filling in what the testimonies did not say. Whatever it was a very powerful image, and it had the one thing that academia did not have. It had emotion, it had urgency, it had a level of humanity that history has a habit of sanitizing. Academia has a certain language with which it expresses itself, a kind of clarity which removes the heartbeat of the story. It's the data points, the numbers, but what is removed, what academia and history deems insignificant, is the very story of the women, not just as victims, not just as the label of birangona, the title that they're given, but who they are as a human being. Their dreams, their thoughts, their ability to shape their relationships after the war, the aftermath of the war, that the after effects that it had on their family, on their children, towards each other. That was entirely missing. And though I found some great accounts of testimony, these were not being translated into the history books, into academia, and it wasn't given its rightful, respectful place. And so I thought fiction would be the great medium for this. It was, in many ways, the only medium that could gather all of these things. It had a generosity of language, which academia does not have. It can gather feelings, and it can gather thoughts and ideologies, and it can go into great depth, and it can accommodate the human heart as well as the human mind, as well as the human soul, and not just the body, which is what academia focuses on.
Stepping into fiction, it brings its own pressures. You've said that much of the women's stories in the First Jasmines are inspired by testimonies collected by academics, social workers, and others, both shortly after the war and also much later. You've also spoken about feeling the weight of responsibility in telling their stories, and even kept the manuscript largely to yourself until the final stages of publication, out of concern that others might dilute your intention or question why this story hadn't been told before. How did you navigate the pressure of doing justice to such a sensitive history? And what did you learn about trust, both in your own voice and in the act of sharing it with the world through that process? What responsibility did you feel in honoring the voices and memories that shaped this novel?
It took me almost 4 years to write this novel, and the weight of the responsibility of holding these voices and trying to do them justice in a fictional context was so great that I often had to take a long break from writing the novel. So I would write maybe every day for 2 weeks, and then I would take a 3-month break. And that is, not a good discipline for a writer, for a novelist, but I really had to think about what my intentions were when I was writing this. I wasn't trying to write at these women. I was trying to write with these women in mind. So the idea of trust is absolutely crucial when it comes to a story like this, because the women themselves and the history of silence that surrounds this event, the women were, yes, they were silenced by society, but they also did not trust other people to be able to hold their stories, whether that was their family, whether that was governments. The moment they were out of captivity, they had entered a very distrustful world. And I wanted to create in this novel a space where the women could not only trust themselves to tell their stories to each other in the safer space with women who were also experiencing these things, but also have their stories held with equal value, which is why I give all the women in the novel space to tell their own stories rather than just focusing entirely on the protagonist. Their stories are given weight, and those stories are inspired directly by testimonies. And I found that I had to accept that there would always be a distance between me as a writer being able to present the story of these women, because I would never be able to, in any way, with any stylistic choice, with any narrative choice, be able to entirely encompass their experience. I could maybe highlight some areas, but what I could do was be respectful of their story. So the narrative is very much shaped by their testimony. The women rarely, if ever, actually mention the act of rape when they are talking about their testimony. And I made a deliberate choice not to make anything graphic. I did not want to make the violence a spectacle against the women, where they are again reduced to a body and reduced to a victim of circumstance for the readers. I wanted to maintain these women as individuals who are first and foremost humans with souls and not just bodies who are being enacted upon. So I respected the style and the method with which these women wanted to narrate their own stories. They spoke a lot about their life before the war, about their relationships, their dreams of getting married to a certain person, their hopes for their children, their relationships with their parents and their sisters. So I spent a lot of time reflecting that in the conversations in the room with the women. And I hope that it does do some justice in humanizing the women beyond the labels that are given by the perpetrators, by the army, by society when they return to their communities, the government. I wanted to center these women as the whole story. And however that is received, I hope it adds to, I hope it's a narrative which adds to more narratives of the war. It doesn't need to be the singular narrative. I would just like to enter the conversation about, who gets to write history and who gets to speak about which parts of history. That is all that I would like for this novel to be.
Language also plays a striking role in the First Jasmines, and Bengali itself carries a deeply political history, from the partition in 1947 to the 1952 language movement in Dhaka, when students were killed protesting for Bengali to be recognized as a state language. The language became a cornerstone of identity and resistance. After 1971, it was enshrined as Bangladesh's national language. And you've shown how Bangla becomes a kind of defensive wall for the women in captivity, a way to assert their identity and resist their Urdu-speaking captors. At the same time, like you mentioned earlier, you explore the more complex dynamics, like the character Suhana, who speaks Urdu and receives certain privileges and eventually leaves with one of her captors after the war. Tell us more about how you approach weaving language, identity, and survival to explore all these complex nuances in the novel.
The importance of language in this novel is central to the idea of resistance in the novel. Language was partly one of the reasons why the war began. So the Western Pakistani elites wanted Urdu to be the official language of the land over Bangla. And there had been protests for many, many years against this kind of imposition on the Bengali people. And within the confines of the room, though the women are stripped of everything else, they have no names for the soldiers. They are just bodies to the soldiers. They have no connections. All of their connections to the outside world is gone. What they do have is their own language, which the other soldiers struggle to understand. And so they switch between the different dialects of Bangla that the women all understand. And through that conversation in Bangla, they're able to form solidarity. They're able to survive in an emotional and psychological sense that they may not have been able to had they been on their own. And they were able to resist the tyranny of the mind because they were able to use their own words for what it meant to be free, what it meant to survive, what it meant to escape. They were able to gather and discuss and explore the ideas of the self. What does it mean now to be a woman and a mother and a wife who had experienced this? So language becomes a source of resistance in the novel. And it also becomes a source of, I guess you could say, anger. It becomes a source of power. The soldiers in the novel, none of them have a name. The politicians, none of them have a name in the novel. And that was in the deliberate sense of the soldiers and the politicians not being able to have a solid foundation in the novel of language that they impose on themselves, how they regard themselves. The women name the soldiers, and they name them with their physical characteristics, just in the same way as the soldiers perceive the women as their physical characteristics. And that is, in a way, an equalizing force in the room. And it becomes, later on, after they leave the room, language and its silences also become a contradictory place, a place of ambiguity, a place of empowerment, a place of survival and loss. And it is within these nuances that the Bangla language holds, removed from Urdu, that the history of these women can be explored in ways that isn't tainted by the views of the general who spoke the order to dominate these women in this way, or the language of the academic which sanitizes the language of pain. These women have control over what they feel and how they feel it.
Just like language is one form of oppression, the novel also deals with the profound aftermath of trauma, as you've mentioned. In an essay published in Himal in 2015, Nayanika Mukherjee writes that only the birangona's horrific history of rape is told, not forgotten or silenced, even as the complexities of her life story are occluded from the prevalent discourse of the war. The First Jasmines highlights this painful truth. The women are largely forgotten, denied access to promised support, shunned by society, and expected to go on with their lives in silence. You've said that the women were often seen as this single collective with one strategy assumed to work for them all. And in the novel, Lucky and Jamila's path diverge in a sense, showing how individual lives were affected. How did you approach portraying not just the war itself, but this long and often invisible aftermath for women? And what do you hope readers take away about the ongoing need to reckon with this history?
I think the aftermath of this war and any war can only be appreciated when the story is told from the beginning, which is why I spend the majority of the book is when the women are in the room held in captive. It was very important to me to individualize each character. They are not a collective in the sense of, yes, they had one shared experience, but the rest of them, their hopes, desires, the way that they handled this tragedy is completely different. What they perceive as possible for them is entirely different. So by having the women engage with each other on a personal level in the room, they were able to see each other as individuals and not just as a collective as well. And that was extremely important. In a society where women consider themselves communally as a wife of the household, or the mother of these children, or a daughter from this family, in this room they were stripped of all these markers of identity, and they were bare and entirely alone with themselves, but also alone with all of these women. And so they were able to converse and realize, maybe for the first time in many, many years, that they do have different ideas and that they can live in different ways. And by individualizing them in the room and then having them be rescued from the room afterwards, it allows the reader to greater appreciate the diverging pathways of all of these women. Some women returned to their life as it was before. Some women were greatly, greatly affected psychologically by the conflict. I mean, there were some rehabilitation centers after the war, but for the majority of women, they were given no social, no economic, no psychological support whatsoever. And so they had almost no one to lean on. No government and no family were able to help them. And what matters in the end is the idea of the human heart, because that is what is central to the story. It matters that some women were able to carry on and maintain a healthy family, and it matters that some women were not able to. The idea of silence in itself is quite an interesting one, because yes, silence was imposed on women, and that is terrible, but some women also chose silence, where they had the ability to not be silent, and that silence as a choice is quite interesting. And I found that whatever the aftermath was, and whatever choices that the women made, there is no clear right and wrong answer. What I wanted to present with a novel was the benefits and the pitfalls of those decisions that these women made, who were so alone and who had so little resources. And so what is often left out in the history book is, yes, these women were victim, and then they were just missing, right? But these women, a lot of these women are still alive, you know? A lot of these girls were taken when they were very young teenagers. Now they are elderly women, but it has been many, many decades and they still haven't been able to receive any of the resources, any of the help. So it's not just that the aftermath was only for a few years after the war, and it resolved itself and people have moved on. There are women who are still living the aftermath of this war, and they are still being neglected by governments and families and societies, and they are still ostracized socially for this experience that they've had, this violent experience that they've had. And it's absolutely essential that, for me, writing the ending of this novel, I kept it ambiguous. I kept it open, the possibility of what may happen to the protagonist, because that is what that was, this great abyss of possibility of a future that may or may not be good. That is what the women had entered into once they had left these camps, these rape camps. And so that is what I left open at the end of the novel, which some readers may find unsatisfying to some end, because it is unsatisfying, because the women had never been helped. They have never been people who have been cared for in this great way. And I think also the aftermath, because it is ongoing, there is still time to make up for all the mistakes that were made during that time. There is still time to be able to help these women who still exist, and to help their families who are dealing with the repercussions of the war. So their experience is not just an event, it's the families inherit the traumas of their mother and their sister and their wife and daughter who experienced this harrowing event.
Saima, I'm glad you brought up the ending of the book, because you've said that the very last line of the First Jasmines came to you first. If I may quote, "The shackles of a darker time cut loose by the white thread of dawn." End quote. You say this was inspired by a photograph of a college girl freed by the Mukti Bahini, her fists raised in defense. Can you tell us more about that inspiration, how that image shaped the ending, and perhaps even the rest of the novel?
The image of the college girl with her hands before her face and her hair in front of her face is such a devastatingly powerful image. And it stayed with me for many, many years, because though the image spoke of a woman who was rescued and who is now safe, it left a lot of lingering questions behind. She is still unable to show her face, though she's in a new land, though she is with her allies now, in her community now. And what happened to this young girl? Did she return to school? Did she return to her family? Was she ever given the help? Was she one of the few lucky women who were ever given the help to try and deal with the situation that she experienced? There's a lot of unfinished and kind of appalling questions that arise when you look at this image. And this leads to the idea of unfinished justice, that though the country after the war and its new government and the new regimes after that government and the continuous regimes, though there have been, trials for the people who helped the soldiers enter the land and who helped the soldiers to capture these women, though there has been education in the curriculum, changing education in the curriculum to try and include the women and include different narratives of the history in the public memory of the history, there are still too many questions that are left unanswered about the women, and very neatly and very deliberately set aside. And that sentiment is one that greatly influenced the novel. I kind of worked backwards from that line and from that image. So I wanted to, through the other characters, flesh out the image of this girl. And there is a character that is similar to this college girl, Rokeya. who is also a college student, who uses her education to learn the language of Urdu, and who, rallies the women to form a plan of escape. And this college girl could have done the same thing, but all of that history is entirely wiped out and removed. And though the photograph is absolutely essential for documenting history, and it's important to have in the archive and in history books, the image also entirely wipes out all the past of this young girl and her future as well. It erases everything just in the same way that history has erased these women's story. And so there's all of these competing, contradictory feelings that arise from this image and that I wanted to express in the novel. And so you have characters who learn the language and in some ways are forced to work with the soldiers. There are women like that, but they are also survivors. And there are women who want to fight, and they are survivors. And there are women who want to hide, and they are survivors. And there are women who want to remain silent, and women who want to speak, and they are also survivors. But this one image, though it is an essential one, it also overshadows in public collective memory the images of the other types of women who were also present in the war. And so from this image, I wanted to kind of rectify the idea of what is the idea of the birangona woman. It is not the government definition, and it's not the soldier's definition, and it's not the country's definition, and it's not the photographer's definition. It is the definition of how the women define themselves in that moment and afterwards.
Early in the novel, you write, if I may quote, "It was an ancient story that could be traced all the way back to Habil and Kabil, thousands of years before the British came, conquered, and cut them into pieces. It was a tale of two brothers and their nation of two tribes, West Pakistan, East Pakistan." End quote. For listeners who may not be familiar, Habil and Kabil are the Quranic and biblical figures of Abel and Cain, the first brothers, whose story is one of jealousy, rivalry, and violence. I was struck by how you connect that parable of brotherhood and conflict to the history of the birth of Bangladesh. What drew you to frame 1971 within this long arc of myth and history, and how do you see allegory working alongside the political reality in your novel?
I found that mythology and allegory had the power to universalize this very human story of the betrayal within brotherhood and take it from this very specific time in history and this very specific event in East Pakistan and allow it to reflect the mistakes that we have made again and again and again in history. This is not just a story about West Pakistan and East Pakistan. This is the story of many wars where people are so easily and so devastatingly easily able to despise their own brothers and be violent towards them. The story of Habil and Kabil is one that I think very succinctly explains the political and economic incentives for West Pakistan to enter into war with East Pakistan. And this is not a unique history. The idea of hoarding resources, this idea of the biblical idea or the Quranic idea or the religious idea of greed, this is not an isolated incident. You can see this across the world everywhere, even now. And it was very important for me to present to the reader that this is a timeless moral problem that we have as humans across history now, and we will probably have in the future, because we are not learning from this. It's happening again and again in almost the exact same way. So this story of the Liberation War of Bangladesh, it's not just a story within 1971. This is an ancient history. And this story of 1971 can be applied to many other histories, just as the histories of women who are raped during war in other countries can inform this history. There were women who were raped in Bosnia. There were women who were raped in Rwanda. And though their geographical locations are different, their situations are appallingly similar. And the testimonies, I read a lot of the testimonies while I was researching for this novel. They were, in many ways, entirely identical. And so, while the reader may have some distance from East Pakistan, they may have some distance from South Asia, they may have some distance from the violence of sexual assault, what they can relate to are the very human moral failings that have plagued the people since the beginning of time, since the beginning of humanity, and that are unfolding before our faces right now. And so it was an appeal from me to the reader that though history may find the story of the Birangona women not important enough to delve into too deeply, this story can be understood by everyone. And so it's also, in many ways, a great warning of how easily the betrayal of brothers who consider themselves their own, brothers in race, in land, in religion, in ethnicity, can so easily turn on each other and retell their story again, maybe in another place, but be retelling the same story. So I found mythology, allegory, parables, and in some ways this story becomes a parable for the injustice and the silencing of memory that is found in all histories about women who are survivors of war.
You've already touched on this, but in the novel, the Pakistani soldiers, you say, move like faceless figures, known only by their descriptors used by the women, like slightly cross-eyed, major mustache. And you say this was deliberate because to the women, they were simply the bodies inflicting pain, just as the women are reduced to bodies themselves by the men. And most of the novel unfolds in the single room, and yet within that confined, brutal space, the women do create something else. It becomes a space for reflection, for them to talk about their experiences of marriage, motherhood, sexuality, bodily autonomy, and survival. You've mentioned wanting to imagine the kinds of conversations that might take place among the women, held for days versus held for months. And the different scars those timelines leave is something that you explore. Could you talk about how you balanced that claustrophobia of setting with these expansive, almost liberating dialogues, and what you hope might come across about trauma healing and women's solidarity through that choice?
What I think is a great flaw of the accounts of history for the Birangona women is the exclusion of the absolutely beautiful relationships that women can have with each other, whether that's through sisterhood, in family, in friendships. And what I wanted to explore in the room was that, stripped of all the markers of their identity, the women as singular people, how they were still able to so generously give to other women. There were women who were older who were giving advice to women who were younger about different things unrelated to the room, giving marital advice, giving advice about family, about friendship. And there were women who, now that in this kind of interesting contradictory way, though they're confined in this room, they're also free of all of societal pressures to speak in a certain way. And so they're able to express themselves in a more truthful way with women who have seen them in their most vulnerable, and women who will listen to them because there is nothing else to do but to listen and to speak in this room. So an element of truth is reached in the room. And I found that by telling each other their stories, the women were able to build a different kind of solidarity, a special kind of solidarity that can only be found in the room and not outside of it. And that, I think, is what is missing from the history books. A lot of the testimonies that I read are very similar, and women do talk of the other women in the room. They tell stories of other women that they had met, but these are not given great value in history books. And they're not given great value outside to the world either, because the communities who often ostracize them make them almost forcefully make them forget all the other women who experience this situation with them. But by having someone else, and Lucky and Jamila are sisters who leave together, who enter into the same extended family, who have very different pathways in the end, they are able to reckon with what actually did happen to them. They had someone else to talk to, unlike many of the other women who left singularly. They had quite a unique experience. And I found that by being able to acknowledge each other, they were, through conversation, able to express a kind of emotional and psychological release that is necessary, and that no one else may have been able to gift them that kind of hearing. And it's very important that the women were still able to talk of things like motherhood, like beauty and desire, things that plagued them in the outside world, that they could finally explore with each other and could finally be honest about. Because sure, there is a war on their bodies inside the room, but there is a war on their bodies outside of the room in a very different manner. And there are things that the women have to navigate and experience in the outside world. And that is to them so extremely important that they are willing to silence this part of their life to have this other part of their life. And so the women, in many ways, they learn from each other, women of different social classes, different backgrounds, and the judgments and preconceived notions that they may have had of these other women who were so very different from themselves. They've learned to respect and gain knowledge, and that there is knowledge to be gained from women of different parts of society. And though it is an uncomfortable truth, the women do gain all kinds of truths, very uncomfortable, very ugly truths. And by knowing this truth, they reach a sense of beauty that only truth can provide. It's ugly, but it is also beautiful, that armed with this knowledge, they can move forward with their lives. And so the room is confinement, but it is also a space for dialogue that the women may never have had in any other circumstance.
Around the time when the First Jasmines was close to publication, Bangladesh was at a political crossroads. With the student revolution and Sheikh Hasina being overthrown, highlighting both distrust of power but also hope for renewal, in a sense. You reflected on how successive governments have used the liberation war selectively while marginalizing the stories of the birangona who survived violence and imprisonment. In your novel, you foreground these women, giving them voice, humanity, and complexity beyond the label of victim or casualty. How do you see the novel in conversation with memory and politics and how women are treated in Bangladesh today? And what do you hope readers would take away about the agency and experiences of the birangona?
The liberation war in the Bangladeshi public memory is a combination of many things. It's sacred in some sense. It is politicized by different regimes and adjusted to fit different ideologies. It is contested by its people and other political parties. It's a very interesting site which has a very rocky foundation. And onto this site where power and violence plays continuously on and on and on again through different governments, the story of the women somehow still always remain in the background. They're used as almost as missiles against other people, as a way to accuse and villainize people who may or may not have been part of the war. And so the women, instead of being seen, they are in many ways weaponized in history to serve a different means for different groups of people. And so what I wanted to do with the First Jasmines is to enter it into a conversation where the women are not just victim, not just carer, not just, person who should be pitied, but that they should also be given a front row seat into what it means to define the public memory of the war. It's very interesting that the country will memorialize and commend generals and the Mukti Bahini fighters, and they will erect museums and they will put these into the school books, and they will have anniversaries and things like this for the heroism of the men. But there is also heroism of the women. The women, there were not just women who were victims of rape. There were women who were fighters, women who were spies, women who aided and nursed people back to health, and who were carers, and who were, even without these titles of status, they were mothers, sisters, and wives who helped their own families and helped their own communities in ways that are just as valuable as a freedom fighter. And so, while the country is in this very interesting interim period and is very distrustful of power, it has the ability and could use this opportunity to reframe the idea of war and reclaim what was once used as a source of subjugation and a show of power, and they can reclaim it together as a country, all parts of society, the people who are part of the war and the children who experienced the inheritance of the war. Everyone can now reclaim this narrative, and we can have many different stories. There is no singular person who can claim the war. There is no singular hero. There is no singular victim. What I found is that while the First Jasmines centers the women in the novel, it should not be the only book that is read about the war. And to gain a true idea of what truth is, readers should read widely across many different perspectives of war, because that is how we get closer to not only humanizing the people of war, but being able to connect with them and hopefully one day be able to recover from our own historical mistakes and hopefully not repeat them. It's very important to have a wide range of perspectives, of knowledge, of story, of narrative.
For listeners interested in how these issues are playing out in Bangladesh today, there's a really insightful episode of State of South Asia where the sociologist and gender expert Samina Lutfa talks with Himal's associate editor Nayantara Narayanan about the current situation of women in Bangladesh, the feminist movement, and how the country's shifting politics are affecting them. Saima, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast, and congratulations again on this brilliant, brilliant book.
Thank you so much for having me and asking me these absolutely incredible questions, which I had to think very, very deeply about. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. And while you're at it, please do also check out Himal's State of South Asia podcast hosted by Associate Editor Nayantara Narayanan, featuring conversations on pressing social and political issues from across South Asia. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asian writing and ideas like no other. And that gives us a very unique community viewpoint and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to support our work, please do become a paying Himal patron for just $5 a month. We have a great program with lots of perks, and we'll welcome you to a fantastic Southasia Review of Books community. Thanks again, and until next time.